In 1901, Australia was federated as a new nation, but it did not invent itself from scratch. It inherited the legal habits, political instincts, and moral assumptions of Britain, including a culture shaped heavily by Protestant Christianity and the Anglican tradition. That legacy was never about forcing belief. It was about limiting power. It helped create a society where conscience mattered, and the state was not supposed to police speech. For most of Australian history, that instinct broadly held. You could criticize a religion, mock an ideology, challenge a priest, a pastor, or a politician, and the country did not collapse. That was part of the inheritance. But in 2025, something was handed to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese that pointed in a very different direction. It was a report which, if its recommendations ever became law, could leave Australia with something it was never supposed to have: an unofficial state religion. And it would not be Christianity, it would be Islam. In September 2024, Prime Minister Albanese appointed British-born Aftab Malik as Australia's Special Envoy to combat Islamophobia. His term began on 14 October. Then, a few months before the Bondi terror attack, Malik delivered his report to the Prime Minister. It was titled, "A National Response to Islamophobia, a Strategic Framework for Inclusion, Safety and Prosperity." That title sounds harmless enough. Strategic framework, inclusion, safety, prosperity. Sounds like boring public service buzzwords. The kind of language modern governments use when they want something to sound managerial and, well, beyond suspicion. But when you look at what the report actually proposes, the scale becomes much harder to ignore. This was not some narrow proposal aimed at punishing abuse or protecting people from street-level harassment. It contained 54 recommendations, which amounted to roughly 180 separate changes, applications, and adjustments across government. And these were not aimed at one obscure agency tucked away in Canberra. They were directed at 12 major Commonwealth institutions, including the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, Home Affairs, the Attorney General's Department, Education, Foreign Affairs, and Parliament itself. To put it simply, this was not pitched as a narrow anti-harassment measure. It was pitched as a response that would change Australian society forever. Once you understand the scale, the core question changes. This is no longer about whether Muslims should be protected from abuse. The real question is what the state now means by Islamophobia and what powers it wants in order to fight it. Quick note before we move on, please remember to give the video a like and hit subscribe if you haven't already. This channel is almost entirely fan supported, so if you want to support the work and the mission behind it, consider joining Patreon. That's what keeps the channel alive and gives you early access. It's completely ad-free on longer and uncensored videos, written articles, and member-only chats. Now, Malik's own report admits there is no universally accepted definition of Islamophobia. I've always maintained that this is on purpose, because Muslim lobby groups can then twist that to include critique of Islam itself. But overall, this is not a small technical issue. That is the issue. If you're asking the state to combat something, monitor something, investigate something, and potentially punish people under laws and policies built around it, then you need to be able to define it first. It is absurd to build legal, bureaucratic, and cultural machinery around a term that is still this vague. You can think about this another way too. Should a vague term that could throw people in jail remain undefined? Of course not. And common sense tells you why. Once a word like that enters government language without a stable definition, it does not stay narrow for long. It gets expanded by activists. It probably will also get inflated by bureaucrats and bent by political pressure. What begins as apparent protection against abuse can very quickly become protection against scrutiny and even satire, and those are not the same thing. And perhaps the most important scenario here is if the term starts to include criticism of Islamic beliefs, texts, and even Islamic law. This would be unlike anything Australia has experienced up until this point. If that happens, you are no longer protecting people, you end up becoming a shield for the religion of Islam itself. And once you look at what the report actually calls for, that fear stops sounding paranoid. First, it calls for a whole new layer of oversight, inquiries, and bureaucracy. Malik wants an overarching monitoring system to make sure that recommendations are enforced, plus commissions of inquiry into Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, and anti-Arab racism. And these would not be confined to one office in Canberra. Their reach would extend into government agencies, the media, schools, workplaces, healthcare, and more. This would be the start of a permanent bureaucracy built to search for these offences everywhere. Second, there is the legal and speech side of it. The report pushes for reviews of counter-terror laws to see whether they have a discriminatory effect on Muslim communities. It proposes legal changes around racial and religious discrimination, new advisory panels, new scrutiny panels, and even changes around visas for visitors accused of promoting hate speech. This could easily catch not just genuine bigots, but outspoken critics of Islam, reformers, ex-Muslims, or even victims of Islamist violence telling the truth about what happened to them. And I'll be honest, I feel like their goal is to probably silence people like me, or say Yazidis, or Coptic Christians, or Jews who have all suffered all over the world under Islamic rule. And let me remind you, they proposed changes to limit counter-terrorism laws that impact Muslims only 2 months before 2 Muslims would commit the worst terror attack in Australian history. Those guys were already being investigated under counter-terror laws, and if these laws were that weak already to let them carry out the attacks regardless, imagine what these recommendations would do if they ever became law. Once the state cannot tell the difference between hatred of people and criticism of ideas, free speech becomes whatever the bureaucracy says it is. This is just one of the many new laws the Australian government and governments all over the West are proposing to stifle your free speech online. That's exactly why I use Proton VPN and why I think you should too. They're based in Switzerland, outside the reach of US, EU, UK, and Australian law. They don't keep logs and are built by the same team behind Proton Mail. When the UK passed its surveillance laws, Proton VPN became the #1 app on the App Store. Their stealth protocol beats censorship firewalls. Secure Core routes your traffic through privacy-first countries, and NetShield blocks trackers before they ever reach you. I've used Proton Mail since Australia announced sweeping surveillance laws last year, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it's now essential. If you want to protect your privacy and support this channel, hit the link below to get up to 60% off Proton VPN. Going back, the final and maybe most revealing recommendation of all is the push into education and culture. These would introduce anti-racism and inclusivity frameworks across education with Islamophobia built into them. That means curriculum reviews on Islam and Muslim history, teaching about Islamic and Western perspectives, and even integrating Islamic studies into higher education as an essential component in some awards. You can no longer opt out. At this stage, this is not some simple anti-discrimination policy. This is the state moving from protecting Muslims as citizens to giving Islam special emphasis inside public life for everyone, Muslim and non-Muslim. You simply would have no choice, and once you reach that point, the line between tolerance and favoritism starts to disappear. Remember, the Special Envoy is reportedly paid almost $500,000 by the taxpayer to produce these totalitarian recommendations. And that is really the heart of my critique here. It is not just that this report goes too far, it is that it was never neutral to begin with. First, because it gives one religion a level of attention, protection, and institutional backing that no other religion in Australia is receiving. Islam is not being treated as one faith among many. It is being singled out for special funding, special sensitivity, special legal concern, and special bureaucratic focus. That cuts directly against the secular character Australia is supposed to have, and against the basic idea that the state should treat religions equally rather than quietly elevating one above the rest. Second, this is how bad ideas become permanent. Not through one dramatic law, but through layers. A panel here, a task force there, training modules, funding streams, curriculum changes, reporting channels, oversight bodies, advisory mechanisms. On their own, each one sounds dry and technical. Together, they form a machine. Once that machine exists, it does not just disappear. It grows and justifies itself, just like the NDIS. You all know today just how difficult it is to fix the machine that is the NDIS, and it just keeps growing by the billions of dollars every year. These proposals to protect Islam will also probably turn into something similar. It will demand more money, more reach, and more power. That is how a political obsession turns into permanent bureaucracy. Third, there is the chilling effect. The danger is not that this framework punishes abuse. It is that it makes everyone more cautious and, frankly, more afraid. journalists start choosing safer words, schools become more ideological, politicians speak in rehearsed slogans, and critics of Islam, whether they are ex-Muslims, reformers, or just ordinary Australians, slowly become people the system treats as a liability. That is how soft censorship works. It does not ban you outright, it just makes honesty very, very expensive. The ordinary person almost certainly loses their voice in this instance. Finally, there is the question hanging over all of this. Why this and why then? At a time when anti-Semitism was spiraling in Australia, why was so much political and institutional energy directed here instead? That question matters as priorities reveal values, and this priority revealed a lot. You can see how powerful demographic change in places like New South Wales has become. The Australian government, you could argue, is almost held hostage to this Islamic voting bloc if they are able to propose such totalitarian recommendations so plainly. Look, no country stays free by accident, and no country loses its voice all at once either. It happens slowly until one day, one religion is not official on paper, but is clearly protected in practice. That is the road Australia is being asked to go down. It points to a country where Islam is treated differently, and the state grows steadily less willing to defend free speech when that religion is involved. And Australians should be asking, very loudly, whether that is really the country they want.
In the neon haze of a broken dawn, steel towers hum, but the wild runs on. A shadow moves through the circus below, half machine, half beast, with a violet glow. They thought the outback was lost to the flame, but a dingo